Chris rolled over in his bed for the umpteenth time. Beads of sweat nestled on his forehead as he stared at the ceiling fan. He could faintly see the fan blades in the eerie light, and for a second they thought they were moving. His mind was playing tricks on them. He wiped the sweat with the back of his head and pulled up the covers to his chin, releasing a sigh before closing his eyes and waiting for him to take him. White. That's all the best thing Chris could describe. Whatever he was just opened his heavy eyes, there was a glow in the room, or at least it seemed like it. Chris couldn't tell. Hell, for all he knew, he just yawned, and the tears are in his eyes that made his vision blurry. No, he thought, rubbing them harshly. Where the hell am I? Chris sat up, rubbing the back of his neck, trying to figure out what was going on. The white space surrounding him sent goosebumps down his arms. Hey man, are you lost? Chris's voice snapped open. They remained fixated on the ground. That voice. Footsteps echoed loudly in the void. Chris could tell they were boots, but he looked up, standing next to his full height, with a full expression of shock. Forrest, he breathed, and suddenly he was teary-eyed out of joy or sadness. It was impossible to determine. Forrest stopped and the color nearly drained from his face as his eyes widened and traveled over Chris in disbelief. He stepped forward and looked into Chris's eyes, using all of his might to not break down, until he realized the grown man before him was his old friend. His friend. Chris, is it really you? Forrest shook his head, still unable to accept the fact that Chris Redfield was right in front of him, physically older and bulky in stature. More so than Forrest could ever remember, but Chris nonetheless. Chris pulled Frost into a tight hug and sobbed into his chest. Forrest, you son of a bitch, it's you! God damn it, you fairy, Forrest mumbled, squeezing his eyes shut to prevent the waterfalls of tears from escaping. It had been too long. For the last time Forrest had seen Chris was in that dreadful night, was in the Arcalay Mountains. The Bravo marksman could still remember the conversation they had right before Forrest boarded the chopper with his team. You'll be fine, Chris assured, as he helped Forrest pack his gear. It's probably just some idiot on acid hijacking people out of there. He passed Forrest a few magazine clips. Remember, no matter what happens, keep your gun close. It's my bundle of joy, Forrest finished, zipping up his duffel bag and running his gloved hand over his mullet. Doesn't that seem a little odd, you know? Getting these calls out of the blue? Chris shrugged. Evil doesn't seem my schedule, Forrest. Like I said, it's probably nothing. You're freaking yourself out. Besides, if shit goes wrong out there, Chris pointed to his chest, me and the others are coming after you, and we'll be right here blasting those monster heads right beside you. But that time never came. Forrest gave one last squeeze and pulled back. I'll be damned, he said, inspecting from Chris's form. My princess is all grown up. Chris laughed and some streams of tears glided down his cheek. Yeah, was all he managed to say, before battling with the joy and sorrow. He hadn't seen Forrest since the mission incident, and he hadn't changed at all. Not that one damn deal was out of place. Even wounds inflicted during that horrible night where they went through, that they were never there. What? No comeback? Forrest shook his head and he crossed his arms. Oh, Christopher, you disappoint me. Chris laughed again before wiping his tears. You still that same clown from back in the day. He fondly remembered that they had poured sugar into the coffee pot in the break of the room of the RPD, and he casually waited for the hallway for any poor soul that would dare drink their poison. Barry had been their first victim, spitting the coffee all over the sink and wiping his mouth in disbelief. He eventually caught on and laughed it off, like it was some good sport he was, making a promise not to tell anybody about the other STARS members about it. No too soon. Victim number 2 came in, was a stick up his ass as usual. Whisker liked his coffee black, and it made it so perfect sense that he was a bitter person anyways, which made Chris and Forrest laugh even harder when Wesker spit up the sugary coffee all over his uniform, and then proceeded to examine the contents of the mug and the pot, wondering where the hell the sugar came from. Forrest and Chris ran up the stairs, laughing hysterically all the way to the STARS office. Chris's features sank down to a gloom, tears filling up the rims of his lids before spilling over. I'm sorry, he said softly. Forrest raised an eyebrow. taken aback by Chris's demeanor. For what? For letting you die, he admitted. I told you that everything would be okay if I had known that we were pawns. But you didn't know, Chris. None of us did. Yeah, things probably would have ended up different, but that's life. Shit happens. I've already come to terms with myself. I'm dead and that's that. Forrest looked around the room and thought, but I'd be killed to be alive again. He looked back at Chris. Speaking of which, how old are you now? Chris wiped the tears from his face, hiding a grin between his hands. 40? 40, damn! You almost can get a senior discount. Yeah, that's what I've been looking forward to, Chris replied with a roll of his eyes. He sighed. Guess it has been a while. You know, despite being the hair short of looking like a fossil, you don't look so bad with those face pubes. Chris! Chris whipped around to see Joseph approach them. Frost? The one and only Frost. Chris couldn't believe it. Joseph, like Forrest, looked the same. The aftermath of the dog attack ceased to exist. The red bandana used to wear is still on his place, accompanied by his goofy expression that made Chris's heart ache even more. Joseph tackled Chris to the ground and pulled him to a headlock. Chris laughed, letting the remainder of his tears fall down as he dripped his defenses. With one final tug around Chris's neck, Joseph stood and put his arms around in victory. And the crowd goes wild! Crowd cheers escaped his mouth. Joseph Frost, the underdog, has finally defeated champion Chris Redfield. More crowd cheers and then a sigh. Damn, it's been like tackling a frickin' bear. He narrowed his eyes. You've gotten older. It's what I told him, Forrest said. He's an old-timer now. Is this really happening? Chris thought, still not sure of what was going on. Did he really die, or was this in some sort of dream? Well, if it isn't Redfield, Enrico strutted towards the group. The Bravo captain studied his face. You might look older, but you still have the equant look on your eyes. Enrico, Chris forced a smile. He was never fond of Enrico. Since the day he met the Bravo captain, he never truly connected with him. It's not like he had with the others on his team. His presence gave Chris a feeling of his hand, though like a bucket of worms, and letting them curl and sliver down his fingers. It was chilling. Let bygones be bygones. Come on, Captain Chris. Wasn't as bad as me. Let's not give him too much credit, said Forrest, while nudging Chris in the shoulder. That goes without saying. It's a good thing if both of you were on different quads. Enrico pulled out a cigarette from his pocket, tapped one, and held against his palm, and lit the other hand. Wouldn't have been hell. His voice was distorted by the cig between his lips. He inhaled and blew smoke off to the side. Then again, I probably would have given you hell right back. It had been my own misfortune to have both of you. Another drag of smoke, puff, and then, before Enrico flicked the axe's ash out of the tip. Trust me, Enrico, I'm not exactly the same person anymore. A lot has changed in the days, and I mean a lot. Chris cleared his throat, feeling a wave of anxiety hit his nerves. I just want you to know that I want you all to know that I have the utmost respect for you, not just teammates but as men. You're all better than I could ever hope to be. You sacrificed your lives and tried to protect the innocent people of Raccoon. Chris swallowed, hoping that he wouldn't start crying again. And to me, you're all heroes, even if everything wasn't so damn corrupt back then. Maybe you'd still be alive if Umbrella didn't exist then. Maybe... There was a moment of silence. It seemed like everyone not only took Chris's words to heart, but couldn't help but take a trip down memory lane, as painful and heartbreaking as it was for that door to open again. Forrest rubbed the back of his neck. Well, shit, man, if anyone should be thanked, it should be you. No, Chris said with a shake of his head. It shouldn't be me. Forrest, you guys went through hell. He looked away and regret facing on his features. And Jill and I and Barry, we didn't even know until it was too late. You guys could have been saved. Enrico gave Chris a shoulder squeeze. Listen, Redfield, we're all part of this sick, twisted game. Neither of us had any idea what it entailed, and he took a drag and puffed out the smoke. We were betrayed, deceived, blind even. Erase all those negative words, and I just set on the focus on the mission itself. We were sent to investigate the murders of the Outer Clay Mountains, right? Chris nodded. Let's just say Umbrella wasn't involved there, and there was really some lunatic or cult running rampant out there. With all the little voodoo shit going on and whatnot, how do you know all the things would have ended the same way if they did inside the mansion? Chris said nothing. You don't. So stop being a chicken and get over with, alright? The sooner you do that, the easier it will be to make amends with yourself. Chris snorted a laugh, nodded in understanding as he composed himself. Thanks, Eureka. I guess it's been hard. And I never got to say... What, goodbye? Enrico scoffed and flicked off the excess cigarette ash. I ain't going anywhere. I don't think any of us are, Captain, Forrest said with a shrug as he picked at his nails. We've been here for a while. He looked up at Chris with a grin. Guess you'll have a lot of time to say goodbye, man. Enrico agreed, before stepping on his cigarette bud. Just don't turn into some pansy if you do. I don't want to have to backhand you. I think I'm more relieved to have promoted to Alpha. Joseph mumbled to Frost and just looked at the time to avoid Enrico's fist. I take that back, Frost. In fact, if you didn't even know what you know now, I'm pretty sure you would have stayed on Bravo, considering the son of a bitch psycho captain then you two had. A low below. Enrico, Chris began calmly. Please don't bring him up. Fuck Wesker, Enrico seethed. I don't know why the hell you're still clinging to him. He pulled out another cigarette and lit it clearly, a nervous habit. He's dead, isn't he? He died in that fucking mansion. Chris took a deep breath and shook his head, his request not to mention the chin of Wesker in deaf ears. No, we thought he did, but when I was on Rockford Island looking for Claire some years back, he was there. He scoffed at Enrico's surprised expression. Yeah, I know, he was different, but he was stronger and powerful than everything I had encountered back in Stars. Chris shrugged. We finally nailed him in Africa, though. How did you kill him? Forrest asked, like an eager child wanting to know the climax of a movie. 2 RPGs to the face. I doubt he could survive that hit, infected or not. Smoke trailed out of Enrico's nostrils. Infected? With what? Forrest and Joseph burst out with laughter. That's what these bastards get, Forrest howled as he continued laughing. Serves him right, Enrico added. He doesn't seem presumptuous in the least, but at least I know he wasn't shy when it came to women. No, Chris shook his head. Not that. I'm not sure if it was a T-virus or whatever it was. Turn him into a BOW. A deep, dark chuckle rumbled from behind Chris, made everyone jump. The more surprise out of everything. The primitive mind never ceased to amuse me. But you're wrong. The virus turned me into a god. Speak of the devil. Chris closed his eyes and silently prayed that this was all part of his imagination, that his mind was testing him at the mention of his former captain. But it couldn't be. Everyone else had heard him too. Chris opened his eyes and scrunched his face in anger. There stood, clad in the fitted black leather outfit Chris saw him last, minus the heavy coat and Wesker usually wore with it. The ex-Alpha captain crossed his arms over his chest and tilted his head mockingly. It does, my heart is so good to see my sobrenness again. How's life? The dark chuckle followed. Oh, you would know, you piece of shit. Enrico flecked the ash off the cigarette. Oh, come now, Enrico, Wesker chided, knitting his golden brows together. Don't tell me you're just sore from the bullet wound I inflicted upon you. Enrico lunged at Wesker, but was blocked by Chris and held back by Forrest and Joseph. Big fucking words coming from a dead guy. I'm gonna fucking glad Redfield kill your ass. Easy, Captain, Forrest warned. He's not worth it. Oh, it will be worth it once I land my foot on his ass. Let me go. Wesker clapped his hands in utter amusement. Yes, do let him go. Would you, Spire? I cannot contain my excitement anymore. Enrico clawed his arms around his stomach and his shoulders, thrashing around like a caged animal ready to fight Wesker head on. I'll kick your ass, you bastard! Just you fucking wait. The blonde smirked and removed his dark shades. Sensitive and long pupils contracted the white space they stayed in, and returned to normal size they adjusted. But everyone but Chris stared into the fiery infernals with a fearful expression. What do you say we test that theory, Enrico? Enough, Wesker. Wesker's eyes dimmed and they flicked towards Chris, as if almost forgetting he was standing near him. They locked stares, neither seeming back down or retaliate. They just stood there, good and evil, right and wrong, staring down at each other until Chris broke the ice. Just leave them alone. You've done enough already. What? No anger? No hatred? What the hell happened to you, Chris? You hate this man. He's taken so much from you. His mind tried to reason, but as soon as it tried to pound into his brain, Chris wouldn't listen. He knew that Wesker had done to him and the others, and he knew that the man had no remorse for his actions. But a part of Chris looked beyond the monster Wesker had become. If in Chris's eyes Wesker had still been his captain, he would never shake that feeling, not even when they have gone so much together. If Umbrella didn't mess with his mind. Do not interfere, Chris. Your selfishness isn't worth a damn. Wesker narrowed his eyes. I suggest you step back. No, Chris stood in front of his friends. No? Wesker chuckled. Selfishness and naive. It seems that it does bring back old memories, doesn't it? How nostalgic. Look, just cut the shit, okay? Chris sighed as he clenched his hands to the sides. I want to talk to you. Talk? Wesker spoke. What do you want to talk? Well, this isn't the first sensible thing you've ever suggested. He shook his head and turned his attention back to Enrico. I'm busy right now. Too busy with your marksmen? Wesker had to chuckle at that. The ex-marksman Chris Stars doesn't exist, and I'm not your captain anymore. If it's your plan to get away, then I suggest you opt for a different approach. Bringing up the past was nothing sort of facade won't get you anywhere. Oh yeah? Chris moved into Wesker's personal space. His eyes never left Wesker's blazing infernal. You don't mess with those days, huh? Enrico scoffed behind Chris. Why would he, Redfield? The guy has dug our graves beforehand. Chris ignored Enrico. Please, Wesker, let's talk. That seemed to rub Wesker the wrong way as he clenched his jaw muscles together. Thinking, debating, eventually he stepped back in resignation, but his eyes never left the team. He still slid his shades back on. Very well, he offered to help Chris lead the way, giving space from the others. Wesker gave a smirk before following behind Chris. Once they were far enough away, Chris cleared his throat. It's been a while, hasn't it? The blonde glanced at Chris from the corner of his eye and sighed. I suppose. A nervous tic caused Chris to rub the back of his head. So, how are you? Wesker stopped. This is what you wanted to talk about? Not why I wanted to rule the world? Why not I betray stars? Or even why I faked my death? But rather how I'm doing? I'm just being polite. You're dead after all. Your point is... Chris rubbed his moist eyes. You don't have to be a jerk. That's my point. I have seen you in years. You'd think this place would have calmed your temper of yours. Why not with the succeeding in the world domination releasing to your precious virus? I have you to thank for that. Sticking your nose in places where it shouldn't be. No surprises there. Awkward silence. Do you remember when I say I'd stay out after lunch was over, and you'd come looking for me, pissed off like a bat out of hell, because I didn't want to go back and finish my reports? Where did you find me? There was a spark of hope behind Chris's hazed eyes as he waited for Wesker to answer. The blonde wanted to knock the BSAA agent down. Was Chris serious? And there was just as soft-hearted. What would I even call it? Wesker thought. Chris does not act this way. Not in my presence. You're joking, right? Wesker said finally. Tell me you're joking, Christopher, because I refuse to play this game of yours. Not being so fun and receiving on the end, huh? Wesker growled and grabbed Chris with one shirt, his forehead inches from his own. Perhaps I'm not making myself clear. Although I find your ignorance highly amusing, do refrain from asking stupid questions when in my presence. I'd much rather you scream your pathetic lungs out about how much you hate me rather than play. Then let's humor, Chris. Stars stand and the dead man, leave the past alone. What inspired back then? Was it all part of the plan? Let it be. Chris was shoved away and Wesker stormed past him without another word. Chris tightened his meaty hands. It was another thing to insult him, which Wesker often did, but to walk away without giving Chris the attention he deserved, because Wesker was sure as hell owed him that much. It was a kick to the nuts. Hey, I'm still talking, asshole. You seem to love the sound of your own voice. Have it, Wesker called over his shoulder. What? Chris growled. It was just like Wesker to feed the flames and not give a shit about who got burned. But Chris did. He charged his ex-captain head on and tackled him from behind. They both struggled on the ground, exchanging punches and a fighting pin to the other. You'll never change, you son of a bitch. Same old song, dance. Chris, you've always been 10 steps behind. Chris went for a headlock, knocking the shades off of Wesker's face, but Wesker easily slipped away and slammed him to the ground. Ah, I hate you, You're so pathetic. You can't even say it without making sure you spelt it right. Wesker straddled Chris and pinned his arms to his side. Get off. You see, you always seem to throw a fit when things don't turn out great for you, Wesker mocked, hovering over inches from Chris's face. The younger man's heavy breaths seemed through Wesker's loose, blonde tendrils, hanging just above his brows. Chris couldn't help but stare at the pools of lava that bored down in his own blue eyes. It was unreal. Somewhere behind those orbs lay evil Stone's eyes that only Chris saw a handful of times back in the day before Umbrella, before the virus, before we were enemies. What are you staring at? Wesker's tone had dropped into a more appropriate level, which Chris was thankful for. He was starting to get an earache with all the screaming. Your eyes, Chris said simply. They say a lot about you. Wesker bared his perfect white teeth in frustration. You're delusional, Chris. There's a lot of pain and anger behind them, Wesker, Chris continued. I've never seen so much in my life. A strong wind wrapped itself around Chris's throat and squeezed. Your life is nothing. What nerve of you to assume you know anything about me? I, have that pain too, Chris choked out, struggling to take in the air. You and I were opposites, but we felt the same pain. Tears drizzled down on the side of his face. Wesker tightened his hold, his eyes burning like hot coals. I should just end your existence right now and save someone else the trouble for doing so in the future. His grip tightened, and he sneered in mock delight. It was an honor to be your nemesis. Goodbye, Chris Redfield. A few black dots swarmed his vision as Chris desperately struggled to breathe. His head started to spin, throbbing as a sensation pounded his forehead. No, not like this. Chris swung his free hand over and grabbed a hold of Wesker's loose hair, receiving a deep animal growl in response, as Wesker's grip loosened. Release me, you fool! Accept your fate. Tears pooled over Chris's eyelids and streamed down his face. He didn't unusually cry, but especially in front of the man he admired and hated at the same time. But this was different. He wouldn't let Wesker carry out his awful deed, no matter how many attempts failed right now. Chris needed to let his feelings out. He didn't know when he'd ever be blonde again. Wesker, I have felt your pain. Umbrella, they betrayed you, like you betrayed me. Chris couldn't control himself. He was downright bawling his eyes out. That took Wesker by utter surprise. He'd never seen Chris cry, even when the blonde had dragged him through hell and back and nearly broke him into pieces. Wesker released his grip, but kept his hands over Chris's neck. Do you know how awful you made me feel after that night at the mansion? Chris then took in fresh air and sighed, trying to calm his heartbeat. I was never the same after that. I looked up to you. We all did. And you've crushed us without mercy. Another trembling intake of the air and sigh. And when I found out you were alive, I couldn't have been happier. Because I knew that I could give it a second chance to end myself. The blonde instinctively wiped the tears lingering at the corner of Chris's eyes and pulled back just as fast, cursing to himself as his human actions. Oh, and you know, after I ended you in Africa, I didn't feel anything different. I thought that I would feel accomplished, satisfied, happy, and in fact, I was miserable. Chris released as his hold on the blonde strands and brought his hands to hold Wesker's cheek, grazing a thumb over the golden brow. Wesker's eyes widened, still not being able to comprehend Chris's unusual actions. The crying, the confessing, the touching. There is not a day that goes by where I don't think of you, Wesker. There it was, Chris Redfield's confession in the open. He practically ripped out his own heart from his chest and held it out to Wesker, offering like a sacrifice in exchange for forgiveness. So, according to you, it seems like I'm the cause of your suffering, Wesker gritted his teeth that held Chris's hands in his face. Is that what you're trying to imply? Chris swallowed hard, too weak to look away from Wesker's crimson eyes. They searched his face, waiting for a response from trembling lips. That's 'cause of my suffering and remedy of my pain. You are both these, Wesker. You imbecile, Wesker seethed, pressing his forehead against Chris. You've really lost your mind, haven't you? The Chris I know, the Chris I knew, would never stoop down low to admit his feelings, especially when they are directed towards me. He narrowed his eyes. You are weak. How can you even fathom that you could ever... What Chris said in the next threw Wesker to a complete loop. He pressed his lips to the blonde's, no more than a few seconds, pulled down from their lips, parting with a smack. Time had frozen, or Chris stopped breathing. He didn't really know. He merely watched Wesker's eyes move from side to side, up and down, searching for an answer, for an excuse, anything to explain what the hell just happened, and waited for Wesker to rip him apart. It just never happened. Just shut the hell up already, Wesker. At least I'm a man enough to admit to everything I've kept inside. You act like you've never had feelings for anything. I never have and never will, Wesker said in denial, and removing himself from Chris as he stood. Chris did the same. However, since we're having a touchy family circle moment, I'll humor you for this final time. He bent over to retrieve his glasses. You are Fibar, the challenging human being. Person, just fucking say person. I see the god complex is still there. The most challenging person I've encountered in all my life is because of this. Wesker shifted his weight, hesitating. I'd admire you, Chris. Aware of those he sees in that way. He scratches his chin, analyzing the former colleagues that they now probably stood within a few from each other. But they didn't even have to be that close. Nah, I just think they're being too long as messed up with our perception. It may be those cigarettes, Captain. Enrico eyed his stick for a moment and shook his head. Shut the hell up, Forrest. Uh-oh. What now, Frost? Joseph raised a hand to Enrico. That was once a flesh bone began to fade into nothing and reappearing, flickering back and forth transparent like a ghost. His spirit and energy was starting to fade. Me too, Forrest revealed the fading of his palms. We gotta tell Chris. Let go of me, Wesker. Wesker pulled Chris's shirt collar up harder. No. You're gonna rip the damn thing. Let me go. Not until I finish saying what I have to. The lava-colored eyes glanced over the STARS members. Then you could all go back to your group of misfits. Fine. Chris pushed off of Wesker's chest and folded his arms in a huff. Make it snappy, all right? Before Wesker could snarl and retort something awful to Chris, he looked down his hands, watching as they fade. He was running out of time. Chris followed the stare and scrunched his face in confusion. What's happening, Wesker? Wesker looked down to see the others walking towards him. It would seem we're running out of time. What? Chris shook his head. No, you haven't finished. You haven't said what you're going to say. Wesker removed his shades and sighed. It's not overexcite yourselves, Chris. No, bullshit me. Tell me, Wesker. Tell me what you need to say before you disappear on me. Chris was pulled into a tightly bound against Wesker's chest. As strong arms encircled his shoulders, Chris gasped into the ex-captain's shoulder, eyed wide and afraid his spine would be snapped in half. I always knew there was something special about you, Chris, Wesker whispered into Chris's ear. Such a shame fate has other plans for us. Despite our lifelong games of cat and mouse, you proved yourself over everyone that I have encountered. Chris's lips trembled. Wesker, what are you? Although I regret to say, Wesker continued, I may never see you again. I want you to know that despite the violence and bloodshed, it was an honor to be your captain. and a privilege to know you. He frowned against Chris's ear at the sound of his sobs. It's not like the end of the world. Perhaps it another in life. Wesker held his arms at length. We will meet again. As Wesker began to fade, Chris bit his lip to prevent himself from crying out. He managed to say, Why, Wesker? Why do you always have to make me suffer? Wesker, for the first time since Chris could remember, generally smiled. Because of your suffering and the remedy of your pain. Wesker's body continued to fade. It wasn't until his face started to materialize that Chris didn't notice a change in Wesker's eyes. The smoldering red eyes that were once the optimum of evil faded into mesmerizing blue stone that Chris remembered seeing each other at the time Wesker removed his glasses all those years ago. No, Wesker, please don't leave me. Don't leave. Redfield, Enrico wrapped his arm around Chris's shoulder and squeezed, separating him from Wesker. It was good seeing you. Tell the others we said hi. Oh, and Barry still owes me money. Refresh his memory for me. Later, man. Forrest stepped and did some bouncy handshake, only to he and Chris. Hope to see you again, but not too soon. You'll need to keep the world safe a bit longer. He gave Wesker a look to which the blonde rolled his eyes. Joseph came from behind the ground and grounded his fist to Chris's scalp. See ya, buddy. Say hi to Jill for me, he said with a wink. All right, Frost. Leave the kid alone. Enrico grabbed Joseph by the ear and yanked him to the side. Shit, he's gonna question if this is all real once he wakes up. Don't traumatize him. He nodded. Forrest, let's continue, get going. See you on the other side, Redfield. The trio turned away and walked away, fading with each step until they have disappeared completely. Only he and Wesker remained. Now that there was the lovely goodbyes out of the way, I do believe it's my time to take my leave. He turned to follow the other's footsteps, until Chris reached out and grabbed Wesker's arm. Please don't! Wesker furrowed his brows and he got back to face Chris. I must, unless you want me to vanish in front of you. You'll be gone forever. Chris buried his arms into his shoulder, shaking his head in denial. I don't know what I'm going to do. What remained of Wesker's arms wrapped around Chris's insurance. You'll get stuck out there before, and you could do it again. Be brave, Chris. You're good at that. Chris inhaled Wesker's scent for the final time and pulled back. Being brave won't change things for the better, Wesker. A chuckle escaped Wesker. Stubborn as always. I suppose the Redfield trade has never shined in the brightest. Wesker placed his sunglasses in Chris's palm and closed his fingers over them. Farewell, Chris. I look forward to seeing you again someday. He narrowed his eyes. You'll do well not to keep me waiting. A ghostly smile hit Wesker's lips, and he gave a nod and turned away, disappearing only after a few steps. It was then that Chris dropped to his knees, cried out his ex-captain's name. His screams echoed into a void with no one to hear him. Chris bolted up from his position in bed, face, chest, and covered in sweat, as he sat there breathing heavily. He wiped his forehead looking down, something with his grasp, his eyes wide in shock when his fingers lifted one by one to reveal a pair of black sunglasses.